Chapter Googolplex, The Last Barricade. In 1915, a Czech guy named Franz Kafka wrote a little book called Die Verwandlung. Even though he was Czech, he grew up in a bilingual environment, and so he wrote his book in German, which was the cool intellectual thing to do at the time anyway, and which is probably why he didn't call it Transformace and write it in Czech. And almost like in Czech, the English version of the German title is best translated as The Transformation, but when Kafka's book was published in English, someone decided that it would be a lot cooler to call it Metamorphosis. People in 1915 were obsessed with being cool, almost as much as their 21st century counterparts. In the first line of Kafka's little book, we discover that the protagonist has been transformed into a giant insect. Poor bastard. It was a pretty depressing book, but it was also quite good, and when I reread it a while back, it made me start to daydream about some transformations of my own. In my daydreams, I decided that it would be really disgusting to be transformed into a big bug, so instead I fantasized that I'd been transformed into the king of the universe. The first thing I did when I became king was to have Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, Bashar al-Assad, and a few other heinous dictators rounded up and thrown into a rat-infested jail cell. I'll deal with you later, I told them. I have something very important to do first. Next, I summoned all the world's tech giants into a conference room for a sit-down. The important ones, at least. I called Tim Cook, Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, Xiaozi Chu. They all readily agreed to come. Against my better judgment, I called Elon, "It's okay to be white and your disability is not my problem," Musk, even though no one likes him anymore, but he said that he'd only show up if I paid X $8 a month for a blue checkmark, so I told him to go to hell. We weren't going to need him anyway. Besides, I was only after his money. When I called Mark Zuckerberg, he asked me if we could meet in the metaverse, but I told him hell no. He said in that case he wasn't going to be able to make it, so I sent a couple of goons to Zuckerberg's office. I told them to pry the VR headset off of his face and drag him kicking and screaming into the meeting if they had to. They had to. It was a bit awkward, but I had no choice. I needed Zuckerberg to be there. I thought about inviting Jeff Bezos, but I decided that we didn't really need him either. I invited Mackenzie Scott instead. She's the one who had money she was willing to spend, and Jeff was too busy building penis rockets. I invited Bill and Melinda Gates. Separate invitations, of course. They all agreed to come. Almost as an afterthought, I invited Larry Page and Sergey Brin, but their people told me that they were off somewhere in an air-conditioned trailer that was stuck in the mud at Burning Man, so I told them never mind. I started the meeting with a simple question to the group. "Where's my app?" "What app?" they asked. "We have lots of apps." "I don't mean those kinds of apps," I told them. "I don't want something that I have to download from your app stores. I want an app that's an intrinsic part of your operating systems. An icon on my home screen wedged between calendar and contacts. A prominent link on my Facebook page, my Google search page, my Bing page. I want to press the Apple key, or the Windows key, and then V. I want vote." "What do you want it to do?" the group asked. "Everything," I told them. "Everything, at least, that I need in order to vote. I want my entire ballot to magically appear every time there's an election. You guys already know enough about us to make that happen," I said. "When it does, I'd like vote to let me browse the candidates, make my choices, swipe right, swipe left, rank choice, whatever's needed, and then have my choices transmitted via blockchain to my board of elections. If there's a problem with my voter registration, I want the app to alert me, and I want it to help me get my registration problems fixed." "The blockchain thing's been talked about," Sundar said. "You're going to get a lot of resistance there." "I know," I told him. "I'm certainly not the first person to propose the use of blockchain technology for voting purposes. Go take a look at what the folks at followmyvote.com have done with their open source software. But we don't need it just yet anyway. We can do the entire vote app and keep it air-gapped from any voting system until somebody somewhere is ready to consider digital integration. Eventually somebody will want to do that, and when everyone else sees how well it works, it'll put pressure on them to do the same. In the meantime, we can make our app print a ballot that looks exactly like the ones we fill out when we vote, can't we?" "Hell," I said, "the last couple of times that I voted in person, the poll worker printed my ballot on the spot anyway." "We could do that," mused Satya, "but a lot of people have tried things like this," he added. "They have," I countered, "but nobody's got it right yet. It's not for a lack of trying, it's really a matter of resources and integration. Can I show you a couple of things?" I asked the group. "Of course," they said. I was getting a little encouraged. Just before the general election of 2022, I told them, I got an alert on my Spotify app. Some in the group had seen it, but I begged their indulgence while I described it to the others. The Spotify alert urged me to visit a couple of websites, I said. I started projecting my laptop onto a large screen, because of course, in my daydream, I had a lot of fancy equipment. The first link that Spotify wanted me to follow was called headcount.org. I showed the group the website. The headcount people are showing me how to register to vote and how to check my registration status, I said. Can you guys make our app do that? I asked. Of course, they said. What would be cool, I told them, is if it could interact with voter registration systems and register voters in at least a semi-automatic way, I said. Not easy, the group said. But doable, I countered. Doable, they agreed. Next, I told them Spotify wanted me to go to a site called ballotready.org. What I saw when I got there was pretty impressive, I told them. Once I told the site where I lived, it generated a complete ballot for the November 2022 election, including the Googolplex of judicial races that pop up in Kentucky every now and then. Where do they get their information? Some in the group wanted to know. I'm glad you asked that question, I told them. Here's what their website says. Where do we get our information? We aggregate information from candidate websites, social media, endorsers, and boards of elections to help you cast an informed vote. If no information is displayed for a candidate, the information online did not meet our research criteria and was not included. They did a pretty good job on my ballot, I told the assembled tech giants and philanthropists. But I pointed out there were some problems. For example, I said there's a completely useless government job in Metro Louisville called Jefferson County Judge Executive. It used to be a real job, I told them, but then the city and county governments merged and now there's only the mayor and the judge job is redundant and blah, blah, blah. Apparently nobody told the poor old Ballot Ready people about the merger, so here's what their website said for my ballot. About Jefferson County Judge Executive. The county judge executive shall be the chief executive of the county and shall have all the powers and perform all the duties of an executive and administrative nature vested in or imposed upon the county or its fiscal county by law or by agreement with any municipality or other subdivision of government, and such additional powers as are granted by the fiscal court. The county judge executive shall be responsible for the proper administration of the affairs of the county placed in his charge. Because precise ballot matching data is not available, this race may or may not appear on your ballot. Now, there are multiple problems with those paragraphs, I said. First of all, I told the assembled folks, because the county judge job is now useless and worthless, the app should be smart enough to tell voters to not even bother with that race. Unless, of course, they want to write in my buddy Ken Herndon's name, I said. Who's Ken Herndon, they wanted to know. Never mind, I said. Let's just move on. Now, I said, let's pretend that the county judge job is still a real job. Read that blurb again. The county judge executive shall be the chief executive of the county, I read from the screen. Those sentences made my brain turn to mush, I complained. Do they tell us anything at all about what the job's really about? No, of course they don't. And one last thing. The job description finishes with a caveat. Because precise ballot matching data is not available, this race may or may not appear on your ballot. Well, why can't we have precise ballot matching data, I wanted to know. You guys have precise everything else matching data about us, don't you? We certainly do, the group admitted. Some of them even looked a little sheepish. I proposed that we sketch out a stick figure prototype of what the app should do. I'm going to draw up an example race, I said. Okay, they answered. They were all being very patient in this fantasy world of mine. Ever since I first voted as a teenager, I told them, there's been a race for something called Soil and Water Commissioner that's popped up on a bunch of my ballots. I'm ashamed to admit it, I said, but even after all these years as an enthusiastic voter, I still have no real idea what a Soil and Water Commissioner is or what a Soil and Water Commissioner does. Something about soil and water? The group was quiet. While I was thinking about the app, I told them, I scoured the websites of no less than 5 municipalities nationwide trying to find out what a Soil and Water Commissioner does. I showed them a brief sampling of what I found. Provides oversight, rules, and policy for the state soil and water conservation programs. Determines the exchange capacity and necessary releases for augmentation purposes by evaluating flow information. Enforces the provisions of Colorado water law and policies of the state engineer by controlling and locking headgates and issuing verbal and written orders restricting diversion as provided by statute. Blah, 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 I complained. Even if I understood what any of that meant, I asked them, do you think that I, as a voter, am ever going to bother to study up on the fine art of soil and water commissioning? Hell no, I'm not. And if I just see a bunch of names on a ballot without any background info, how am I going to cast an informed and intelligent vote for Soil and Water Commissioner? You're not, they admitted. Exactly, I said, so let's sketch out something that might work for voters. How about this, I said, a theoretical election for the Soil and Water Commissioner of a fictional land called Snyder County. Soil and Water Commissioner, Snyder County. The primary source of water for the residents of Snyder County is the Jean River. The Soil and Water Commissioner ensures that this precious resource is allocated fairly and equitably among the residents and commercial enterprises of Snyder County. The Commissioner coordinates with other governments whose jurisdictions also depend on the Jean River's resources. The Commissioner is responsible for ensuring that all water and soil resources are kept clean and safe. The Commissioner has the power to initiate enforcement actions and to levy fines for violation of Snyder County and federal land and water use regulations. You are electing a candidate to a 4-year term at an annual salary of 4.1 Bitcoin. The winning candidate will oversee an office of 10 personnel with an annual budget of 55 Bitcoin. The following candidates have filed a run for the office of Soil and Water Commissioner. QWERTY McDirty, independent, age and place of residence unknown. Mr. McDirty failed to provide any biographical information to the vote app. Lorne Jarbo, Bald Party, 44, birthplace West Butyl, Kentucky, currently a resident of Jeantown. Mr. Jarbo holds a high school GED and is currently employed as a telemarketing representative. His claims to hold a PhD in dirtology are disputed. Irma Gerd, Whig Party, 52, birthplace and current residence Snyderville. Ms. Gerd holds a master's degree in hydrotechnical engineering from the Gene Snyder College of Science and the Performing Arts. Currently, she is the Assistant Soil and Water Commissioner of Snyder County. Candidate statements. QWERTY McDirty failed to provide any information. Lorne Jarbo, the vote app is wrong. I do have a PhD in dirtology from the University of American Samoa, and I love the soil. I love water, too. In fact, you could say I have ice water in my veins. My opponent Irma Gerd hates water. I have it on good authority that she hates people, too, because they're mostly made of water. Everybody says that. And I heard that she soils her pants. Irma Gerd. I lived in many places during my adult life, but for the last 8 years I've been a resident of Snyder County where I was born, and my most fervent desire is to provide all Snyderians with the best possible soil and water that a county can provide. I'm particularly concerned about the levels of dioxin that were found in soil samples on the former site of Joe's Garage on K Street in Snyderville. We now have the garage surrounded, and I've developed a plan that details how we can safely and economically remove that dioxin. If you'd like more information about our project, you can find it by following this link, https://thedirtonirma.org. I'm going to ignore my opponent's negative comments as they're beneath the dignity of the electoral process, as well as the Office of Soil and Water Commissioner of Snyder County. I've worked for our retiring commissioner, Delilah Mudd, for many years, and I feel that I'm the best qualified candidate to take her place. If you agree, please swipe right. The group was silent. They were thinking. Mackenzie and Melinda started whispering to one another. That was a good sign, I thought to myself. Now, I said to the group, we're going to have a referee for this process, obviously. Note that Mr. Jarbo made some ludicrous assertions in his candidate statement. We need somebody to police that crap, I said. Like the content moderators that all you social media people employ. PolitiFact does a pretty good job of moderating election information. How about we get them or someone like them to provide a little moderation? Here's an example. PolitiFact. There is no evidence to support Mr. Jarbo's assertion that Ms. Gerd soils her pants. His statements regarding Ms. Gerd's attitudes toward water and people are speculative and hyperbolic. The University of American Samoa is a fictitious university that was used years ago as a plot device on a popular TV show called Breaking Bad. Because there is no University of American Samoa, and because dirtology is not an accredited discipline that is recognized by any real university, Mr. Jarbo's claim that he holds a PhD is demonstrably false. We have verified that Ms. Gerd graduated summa cum laude with an accredited master's degree in hydrotechnical engineering from the Gene Snyder College of Science and the Performing Arts in 2031. There, I said. Given that all politics is local, like the old saying goes, imagine what an app like Vote could do. Voters would actually know a little bit about local positions and candidates. City council, state representatives, land surveyors, whatever they are, soil and water commissioners, even judges. I told the group how enormous and unwieldy our ballots sometimes were, and about how people would approach me in polling stations and ask me if I knew who any of the judicial candidates were. If they had a proper vote app, I said, they wouldn't have to ask. In Louisville, there's an organization called Citizens for Better Judges, I told the group. Sometimes they make recommendations in judicial races, and if they do, I almost always follow their advice because they know a hell of a lot more about judges than I do, even though I know a lot of them. Maybe we could let other groups like that make recommendations or add information in the app. Groups like the League of Women Voters or Vote Smart. Then voters could make informed choices. The group nodded their approval. Now, I said, let's consider what else the app could do. I told them about the Quinn Chapel in the west end of Louisville, Kentucky, where I'd campaigned all those years ago. About how I was in a room where there were only a few candidates and a few voters. And about how the preacher there told us, I know what you're thinking. There aren't many of us here. But I want you to notice that the ones who are here are asking questions, and they're taking notes. And they're going to go home. They're going to go to work and to school. They're going to come back to church. And they're going to talk about who was here and who wasn't. And what got said and what didn't. They'd built a trusted network of information, I told the group. And they weren't the only ones. Groups all over the west end of Louisville had done the same thing, I said. What if the voters of Jackson, Mississippi and East Palestine, Ohio had an app like Vote that modeled those networks? They could ask candidates the tough questions that needed to be asked, like the voters at the Quinn Chapel did. In Jackson, they're worried about their broken-down water system. And in East Palestine, they want to know about environmental cleanup after that awful rail disaster. The group was quiet, but I could tell that they were all sketching out ideas in their minds. They were, after all, very bright and talented people. Guess what else, I told them without waiting. With no money, I used those people-powered networks in the west end of Louisville to beat one of the guys who was up with TV ads, a guy who'd been on CNN. At least I beat him in the precincts where the networks were in operation, I said. Can you guys model the Quinn Chapel Trusted Network in our app? They thought for a minute. We can, they decided. We can do that. I was getting really encouraged. I want to talk about referendums too, I told the group. Once upon a time, I was involved with a group that lobbied for removal of a freeway from Louisville's riverfront, I said. It was a complex issue that was difficult to present to voters in a clear, concise way. But maybe our vote app could help with that. It might also give us the chance to take the temperature of the electorate on important local issues like urban planning, I said. And we wouldn't even have to wait for an election cycle to do that, I said. We could make our app ask questions on important issues anytime. Everyone in the group nodded. Now let's move up the food chain a little, I said. To governor's races, congressional races, Senate races, hell, even presidential races. If I have all the information I need inside my app, I said, maybe I, as a voter, will learn over time to trust that information and tune out all the rest of the crap that poisons the internets and the airwaves. Let the fools spend all the money they want on media buys, I said, but let them find out that they're just wasting it. They won't need it anymore. Maybe, just maybe, I said, voters will learn that the only real place to make voting choices is vote. When I talked about the money part, I saw Zuckerberg squirm, but to his credit, he didn't argue. That was my cue to tell him some things that he wanted to hear. Let me tell you about the Kentucky 3rd District congressional race of 1962, I said. It pitted a fine gentleman named Frank Burke, the incumbent, against an arrogant ass named Gene Snyder. Snyder barely won. But what if, I postulated, the voters of 1962 Louisville, Kentucky had had our vote app? If you stick some way cool multimedia content into the app, voters will see the personalities of the candidates shine through. If they'd had the vote app, swing voters in 1962 might have seen what a fine gentleman Frank was and what an arrogant ass Gene was. That might have convinced a couple thousand people to vote for Frank instead of for Gene, I said, and that would have changed history. The federal courthouse in Louisville would now be named the Frank Burke Federal Courthouse, and Interstate 265 around Louisville would still be called the Jefferson Freeway. They looked a bit puzzled about the history part, so I explained it to them. Ah, they said, now we get it. I could tell that I'd grabbed Zuckerberg's attention, so I pressed my advantage. I told the group about my kitchen encounter with EP Tom Sawyer all those years ago, the time when my father and I fixed his dishwasher and Tom was afraid that he'd stepped on my finger. You want to get all metaversy? Then put me, the voter, into a virtual kitchen with Urban Powers Sawyer, the candidate, who was a great man and a kind man. Let me see the kindness and compassion in his eyes. Let that kindness and compassion convince me, a Democrat, to vote for a guy like him, a Republican, even if we disagree on a few issues. I could see that Zuckerberg was getting interested. He started scribbling some notes. But then some in the group asked, "Who's going to pay for all this?" "You are," I told them. "The Vote app software will be open source, and it'll be an industry-wide collaborative effort. That should help to mollify at least some of the people who'll scream and holler about privacy. To me, privacy isn't a big issue anyway. I've seen plenty of voter databases," I said. "Our Vote app isn't going to tell you much of anything that you don't already know about us. But the open source nature of the software will allow everyone to verify that their voting choices stay private. Plus, using it will be voluntary. And the app could be a mechanism to completely eliminate voter fraud. You guys will ensure that everyone who generates a ballot is properly registered and that they'll be able to do so in only one jurisdiction." Some in the group nodded. "A real app like Vote couldn't help but be a boon for civic engagement," I continued. "Young people live on their phones, but far too many of them aren't at all civically engaged. Anybody read Richard Haas's book, The Bill of Obligations? How about Ben Sheehan's book, OMFG WTF Does the Constitution Actually Say?" "I learned about both books by watching the PBS NewsHour," I said. When I asked about the books, of course I looked at Bill Gates, and of course he nodded a knowing smile. "The biggest threat to democracy comes from within," Haas wrote. "We can't afford another January 6th. Number 7 on his list of obligations is to participate in your nation's political life." Haas and Sheehan both wrote that we have to get the younger generations, in legion, to become actively engaged in the political process. "You guys are the only ones who can effectively do that," I told them. "You're all going to collect and vet the information that we need for elections. Lots of good folks will want to help. Maybe some fancy Dan AI can help too. It'll be financed by all of you, but especially you social media folks. You're the ones who got us into the mess that we're in, so you're going to be the ones to get us out of it. You owe us. If you can spend tons of money playing whack-a-mole with misinformation and disinformation, you can spend a little money to create a quiet space for democracy, can't you? A moderated, safe space only for elections and a few referendums. Only candidates and only a few vetted voters who ask really tough questions. Maybe I'm naive, but I really don't think that cost will even be a major factor for you guys. Hell," I said, "we all just watched Elon Musk set a match to $44 billion just so that he could burn down Twitter, or X, or whatever the hell it's called now. And Mark, how many billions have you blown building stuff for VR headsets that nobody wants to wear, just so people could live in a virtual world where nobody wants to be?" "I don't want to think about it," he said. "You are naive. This will never work," a strange voice boomed from the back of the room. It was Elon Musk, and he'd snuck into the meeting unnoticed, even though I'd disinvited him. "Why won't it?" the group challenged him. "Because it just won't," Elon said, and he knew that because he knew everything. "Remember what Franklin Roosevelt said," Bill Gates countered. He'd read everything about FDR, and he knew that Musk didn't read anything, except tweets. Gates quoted Roosevelt. "It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." "Exactly," I said. "Why don't we at least give this thing a try?" Elon's right about one thing. I am naive, but I still can't help but think that Vote might finally help us break down the last barricades to real democracy. An app like Vote could help to create a real, informed electorate. It isn't going to solve everything, but maybe it'll help. And it could be the way that we finally crash through the gate that big money has built to stop us. And not just in the United States, I added. In every country, everywhere, where real democracy is practiced. And maybe even in a few countries where it isn't. Let Vlad the Putin explain to the Russian people why the Vote app has been removed from Russian versions of Android. The group was quiet for a few moments. Finally, Satya broke the silence. "This really could be transformative," he said. "A metamorphosis for democracy," said Bill Gates with a wink. That made me smile, but when he uttered those words, the spell was broken. I woke up in a small room, and I was all alone. I was no longer the king of the universe. There were no tech giants there. No philanthropists. No laptop, no big projection screen, and no vote. But it had been a hell of a nice daydream while it lasted. And I hadn't starved to death either, unlike the poor bastard in the real metamorphosis. "I will meet you at Lviv Chocolate, Boris Hrinchenko Street. This is also a good place to get chocolate if you need any, or if you want to get a gift for anyone. We can walk from there. The place is a bit hard to find on your own." That was the text of an email I got from my old friend Inka Weisbecker on the 6th of December, 2017, at 2:16 in the afternoon. I know all of that because I still have the message. It was sent from her Gmail address to mine, and of course Google remembers everything about you. unless you work hard to make it forget. After Tyler's mayoral race ended in 2010, I lost touch with a lot of the folks I'd gotten to know through politics. Carolyn and I started spending more time in Montreal. Other people left town. Ways led on to ways. Inca got her Ph.D., took off to Harvard, and then to parts unknown. Until a few days before I got that email from her, we hadn't talked in years. Neither had I talked for eons to Benjamin Plume, the other German from Berlin who'd been a loyal campaign volunteer in 2006. But for some reason in the fall of 2017, Ben and I decided to get together for a beer. We both wanted to gab and catch up. He was still living in Louisville, and by happy chance he sent me a message while Carolyn and I were there, too. When we got together, I mentioned to Ben that I was headed to Ukraine to work on a big software project. You know that Inca's in Kyiv, he told me. No, I didn't know, I said. I'll be spending a lot of time in Kyiv, I told Ben, and I simply must look her up. And I resolved to myself that I would. In late November of 2017, I flew to Lviv in western Ukraine. Unfortunately, my luggage didn't. Once it was determined that my suitcase was MIA, I rented a car and headed to a little town called Rivne, 3 hours to the northeast of Lviv, to visit a manufacturing plant that was a part of our project. The nice lady at the Lviv airport car rental office admonished me for not having an international driver's license. I'd gotten them in the past, I told her, but nobody ever wanted to see them. But I was in Ukraine now, and things were a bit different than what I was used to. But the nice lady was cool, and she gave me a car anyway. A little blue Renault. The road to Rivne was allegedly an interstate, but I quickly learned that the Ukrainian definition of interstate differed as well from what I was used to. Often the road was narrow and twisty and had only 2 lanes. I drove 3 hours in the dark, slowly and carefully. The Cyrillic road signs intimidated me, even though I could cipher them out if given enough time. The rental car lady had warned me that there would be speed traps along my route, and sure enough, in the middle of nowhere, in a zone with a 50-kilometer-per-hour speed limit, I stumbled on one. A lone guy dressed in military garb standing on the side of the road. But I was only going 45 when I spotted him, and he just stared at me as I passed. It was very late when I wedged the Renault into the little parking lot of the Hotel Ukraini in Rivne. The lobby was dark, save for a small nightlight. I rang a bell, and eventually a dour and very sleepy-looking woman appeared at the desk. She spoke no English, but with a little hand-waving and a bit of Google Translate, she managed to find my reservation and assign me a room. It was huge and seemed very Soviet. The room was at least twice the size of any other hotel room I've ever rented. It was nice and it was clean and the bed was comfortable. But to me it all just felt so Soviet. And of course it felt that way because I was so woefully ignorant of Ukrainian history. I spent a few days in Rivne with our client's chief engineer. He was an Italian guy, but his wife is Ukrainian and he'd lived in Kyiv for many years. He spent lots of his time traveling around Ukraine to visit his company's manufacturing plants. He spoke excellent Ukrainian and English, and Russian, and Italian, of course. I envy true polyglots. He showed me around his company's manufacturing plant near Rivne. It was an old plant, and the grounds were littered with giant pieces of abandoned, rusting Soviet-era equipment. After a couple of days meeting with him and wearing the same clothes, I was off to Kyiv. Fortunately, just before I left, my bag showed up. Minus one wheel. Apparently the gremlins who inhabit the bowels of the Vienna airport had gnawed it off. About halfway to Kyiv, the road finally grew into a real interstate, 4 lanes with a median. Mule-drawn carts crossed the highway at random spots. Groups of people standing on the road waited for buses because the road was the bus stop. Just east of the town of Zhytomyr, I stopped at a really nice restaurant called Filverok. The interior of the restaurant was the very definition of what the Germans call Gemütlichkeit. Try as we might, there is simply no good way to say Gemütlichkeit in English. Our word coziness just doesn't come close to describing what Gemütlichkeit really is. It means far more than just coziness. Anyone who's ever been in a gemütlich European locale knows what I mean. In Filverok there was a warm fireplace in the middle of the dining room. The food was excellent, and I so desperately wanted a beer to go with it, but I'd read somewhere, incorrectly, that Ukraine had a zero-tolerance policy for drinking and driving, so I refrained. It was too easy for me to believe what I'd read about drinking and driving in Ukraine, because in the old Cold War days, all East Bloc countries had zero-tolerance policies. If you drank, you didn't drive, or if you did, you ended up in some dank secret police detention cell somewhere. At least that's what I'd been led to believe. Everything about being in the old evil empire intimidated the hell out of a Cold War kid like me. It all just seemed so Soviet. When I arrived in Kyiv, I found a fascinating mix of old and new. There were lots of old Soviet-era buildings, but right next to many of them I saw modern, trendy, new construction. I booked a room at a high-rise glass and steel Ramada Inn next to a big shopping mall on the southern outskirts of Kyiv, where on Google Maps it looked as though I'd only have a short commute to our client's office. On the morning of my first visit, it took me 3 hours to get there. It wasn't because of traffic, it was because Google couldn't get me there. In the dense urban environment, I kept missing turns because Google Maps in 2017 couldn't handle the Cyrillic alphabet, and it also didn't know about one of the critical roads I needed to take. Google Maps kept telling me things like, in 300 meters, turn left on, and then silence, as if it was saying, oh, I can't possibly pronounce that name. I crossed the Dnipro River 4 times when I didn't need to cross it at all. Of course, when I did that, I got stuck in traffic jams I didn't need to be in. When I finally got near the vicinity of my destination, the road that Google Maps told me to take kept bringing me to a dead end. It was as though Google Maps was telling me that I couldn't get there from here. I remembered the old Cold War days when we were told that the Soviets deliberately published falsified maps. They thought that doing so would help to confuse the NATO armies who they were convinced were hell-bent to invade them. I couldn't help but wonder if some of that bad data had found its way into the Googolplex at Mountain View. My Google timeline for that first morning commute looks like a comical spaghetti mess of wrong turns and detours. I know that because I looked it up while writing this book. I used the Google timeline to retrace my entire journey from Vienna, where gremlins gnawed on my luggage, to Lviv and to Rivne and then to Kyiv. Google knows the roads that I traveled, even if some of them were wrong. It knows what restaurants I ate in and the names of the hotels where I stayed. If you let it, Google will remember almost everything about you. It's supposed to be a symbiotic relationship. For Google, the marketing data that they collect on us is invaluable. For us, the data is supposed to help Google help us to live better lives. Maybe, to a point, it does. But I can't help wonder, if it can do all that, why can't it help us to vote? After work, I started meeting with Inka a lot. We had tons of catching up to do. After she'd finished her PhD in Louisville, she went to Harvard and added a master's degree. After that, she started working for NGOs and had been to all kinds of crazy and dangerous places. Now she was working for an NGO in Kyiv. She'd married an American guy named Brian who just finished a stint at the State Department. We started hanging out a lot together and we had a great time. Inka and Brian had been in Kyiv for a while and they were great tour guides. My favorite hangout became a bar whose English name translated to The Life of Wonderful People on a trendy, cool street called Velika Vasilkivska. It was a really dumb name for a bar, but it was a very cool place. It was glassy and neon and library-like inside. It had a menu full of cocktails with fun-sounding names, and after a long day of exhausting technical meetings conducted mostly in Russian, which of course I didn't understand, it felt nice to just sit on a sofa and gab in English and knock back a few fun drinks. I will meet you at Lviv Chocolate, Inka had written. The chocolate shop sat at one corner of Maidan Square, and my meeting with her was the first time I'd managed to visit the place where the Ukrainian people started a revolution in 2014. I was dimly aware of what had happened there, but after having spent years planning to fight it, I still knew far too little about Ukraine and its history, even its recent history. In 2004, a pro-Western politician named Viktor Yushchenko ran for president of Ukraine against a Kremlin-backed opponent named Viktor Yanukovych. During the campaign, Yushchenko was mysteriously poisoned, and although he survived, he was left badly disfigured. Clearly, the Russians didn't want Yushchenko to become president. After a controversial election, Yushchenko prevailed, but his administration only lasted a single term. In the 2010 presidential race, Yanukovych was elected, and Vladimir Putin had the sympathetic Ukrainian government that he wanted. In November of 2013, Yanukovych refused to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union, announcing that he preferred to do business with Russia instead. The Ukrainians had had enough. Protests erupted, and on the 18th of February 2014, tens of thousands of people descended on the Ukrainian parliament in Kyiv's central Maidan Square. Over the next few days, scores of people were killed in violent clashes. The trade union building at Maidan Square was set ablaze. When I arrived at the square, the still burnt hulk of the building was covered by a giant tarpaulin. On the tarp was a picture of a broken chain, and in Ukrainian on one side and English on another, giant words were written. Freedom is our religion. Not far from the square, I saw a small memorial to a Ukrainian soldier who'd been killed in the clashes. The inscription on his memorial read, Hero of Ukraine, Sergei Komsky, died on 20 February 2014. Inca was right. Lviv Chocolate was a nice shop, and I did buy a bunch of chocolate to take home. They sold some of their wares in colorful cardboard cylinders, and even though the chocolate is long gone, I still have the cylinders because they look cool. Inca explained that Lviv's chocolate was far better than the crap that was peddled by the chocolate king Petro Poroshenko. Poroshenko made a fortune as an industrialist. His firms manufactured auto parts, and he owned one of the largest confectionaries on the planet. In 2014, he made it onto Forbes' list of billionaires. Poroshenko became president of Ukraine that same year after the Maidan Revolution, and he was a staunch defender of Ukrainian sovereignty, but he was unable to tame the rampant corruption that had plagued Ukraine since the Soviet days. In the presidential election of 2019, he was soundly defeated by a comedian named Volodymyr Zelensky. From Lviv Chocolates, Inca led me to a glass dome in the center of Maidan Square, and we entered an elevator which led to an underground shopping mall. In between the buttons for the first and second floors was a button labeled OB. Inca pressed it, and when the doors opened, we entered a small gift shop. On the desk of the shop was a small paper card on which was written a Ukrainian phrase in both Cyrillic and Western characters. Borytesya I poboret. Fight and win. The receptionist prompted us to read the words on the card, and once uttered, he opened a door behind the desk, which led to a small antechamber. Inside the antechamber was another door. One wall of the antechamber was constructed of welded steel plates, and it was covered with sculptured metal hands. A door at the end of the antechamber opened to a huge restaurant named Ostanya Barricade, the last barricade. The restaurant was beautiful inside, and part of it was incorporated into the foundation of the St. Michael's Arch that adorned Maidan Square above us. All the food, all the wine, and in fact all of the products that the restaurant offered were of Ukrainian origin. Inca told me that the metal hands we'd seen on the walls of the antechamber were symbols of the years that Ukraine spent under Russian oppression. We ate and drank and gabbed, and we had a great time. I even finished with a shot of Ukrainian horseradish schnapps, which wasn't nearly as bad as it sounds. And even though I generally take a dim view of themed restaurants, inside the last barricade I finally began to get it. Ukraine wasn't Soviet at all. It was Ukraine. Ukrainians were proud and they were tough. They loved their independence, and they knew far better than most what the cost of that independence really was. I started to love those people. I went back to Kyiv on a short business trip in the fall of 2019. Inca and Brian were long gone. She'd taken a job in Switzerland. I couldn't help but notice the changes in the city that had taken place in the 2 years since my last visit. There was a lot more glass and steel. There was construction everywhere. I ran into bunches of Americans and Western Europeans who had landed in Kyiv to work for startups, mostly software startups. By coincidence, I booked an Airbnb apartment in the city only a few blocks from my favorite bar with the silly name, The Life of Wonderful People. I went there every night after work, and I struck up conversations with anyone who'd put up with me. I was under no business pressure on this trip, and I was in a good mood. I was garrulous, a little too garrulous. One evening after leaving the bar, on the short walk back to my apartment, a guy rushed past me on the sidewalk and dropped a small plastic bag with money wrapped tightly inside. I could see that they were US dollars. By instinct, I picked it up and yelled, "Hey!" The guy stopped, looked, took back the bag, shook my hand, and thanked me profusely. Then he said, in poor but understandable English, "Wait a minute, there were 2 bags. Did you see the other one?" I didn't, of course, and I told him so. He walked back and forth on the sidewalk looking for another bag, and then he motioned me to come to some steps in the shadows of a building. I'm dumb and naive, but at this point even I smelled a rat. I was, of course, in the middle of a classic pigeon drop. As I was about to walk away, a second guy, slim and stern and wearing a baseball cap, produced a police ID, or at least something that looked like one. Of course it was in Cyrillic and I couldn't really make it out. He identified himself as a policeman, and he asked us both what was going on. The bag guy explained in English that I'd alerted him to the dropped bag of money, but that there was a second one. The policeman said, "Well then, he's a nice guy and he did you a favor." Then the bag guy started babbling to him in Russian, and the policeman said to me in English, "He thinks that you took his second bag. If you have no plastic bag on you, then no problem. Empty your pockets." I was nervous as hell. This guy was most probably a part of the pigeon drop scheme, I figured, but maybe he wasn't. If he really was a policeman, I didn't want to cause any trouble. All the old indoctrination about the dangers of the evil empire came flooding back. I emptied my pockets, but I kept my hands around the policeman's as he rifled through my wallet and looked at my passport. I was afraid that at any moment he was going to run off with all of it, but I was much bigger than him, and I resolved that if he did try to run, I'd tackle him. I made sure to stand between him and the bag guy so that he couldn't toss anything to him. There wasn't much to toss anyway. My wallet contained nothing but a Canadian $10 bill and a few dollars worth of Ukrainian hryvnia. And a bunch of credit cards, of course. After what seemed like an eternity, the policeman finally handed me back all of my stuff. He told the other guy to get lost. And then he told me, "There will be big demonstrations on the street here tomorrow. You should stay away." And sure enough, the next day there was a big demonstration. Something about wages and corruption, I think. Even though there wasn't much money in it, I've never been able to figure out why the policeman didn't try to run off with my wallet, or why he warned me about the demonstration. I went back to the last Barricade restaurant one more time while I was there in 2019 with one of my work buddies. Her name is Antonina Mavrodi, and she was the translator for most of the long meetings I sat through, poor thing. She'd never been to the last Barricade, so I asked her to go with me because I really wanted to eat there again. We ate and drank and had a big time just like I'd had a couple of years earlier with Inca. After dinner, Antonina led me to the Klitschko Glass Bridge, where every Kyiv tourist has to go. From the bridge, you get a beautiful view of the Dnipro River Valley below. I took Antonina's picture for her to send to her parents in Mykolaiv. We stood there in the night stillness, looking at the lights, and Antonina said quietly, "I love my city." It was a Thursday, it was, the 24th of February, 2022. That morning, the Russian army invaded Ukraine. I was in Montreal, and via Facebook Messenger, Antonina wrote, "Hi, I am alive so far. There are explosions in the city, trying to figure out what is going on." We'd been exchanging nervous messages in the days leading up to the invasion. On television, I saw the skyline of the city that I'd gotten to know well. The sounds of air raid sirens brought tears to my eyes. A few weeks later, I watched in horror as a Russian missile exploded next to the Klitschko Glass Bridge, only a few meters from where I'd once stood and taken Antonina's picture. A few days after the invasion, Antonina fled Kyiv in a caravan of 6 cars. They drove 16 hours to the west to the Carpathian Mountains. Her parents, her sister, and her nephew, who all still lived in Mykolaiv, were forced to abandon their house and hide in a bomb shelter. They lived there for 6 days with almost no food, very little water, and no sanitation before they were able to escape the city. Can any of us imagine what that was like? The answer is simple. No, we cannot. I love my city. Antonina's words still haunt me. But she and her family are among the lucky ones. They managed to escape the war, and they reunited in Sofia, Bulgaria. I heard from a few of the other Ukrainian work colleagues I knew, but from some of the others there was no response to my messages. I was left wondering if they were okay. I couldn't help but wonder about all the other people I'd met in Ukraine. The nice lady at the rental car counter in Lviv. The grumpy, sleepy lady at the hotel in Rivne. I even thought about the pigeon drop guys in Kyiv. I wondered where they all were and how they all were. I can only imagine what it must be like for Ukrainians who were forced to flee their country, wondering the same things about the people they love. In another scene in the movie Patton, George C. Scott's title character is told of General Anthony McAuliffe's famous response to German demands that he surrender. While surrounded and in a situation that seemed hopeless, the general gave the Germans a one-word answer: nuts. When informed of McAuliffe's response, Patton laughed and said, "A man that eloquent has to be saved." In the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Russian Navy confronted the defenders of tiny Snake Island in the Black Sea. From the deck of the warship Moskva, the Russians demanded that the Ukrainians surrender. The Ukrainian response will live in legend alongside that of General McAuliffe. Russian warship, go fuck yourself. People that eloquent just have to be saved. Only the Ukrainians don't need to be saved, they can do that themselves. They only need us to give them the means to do so. For the sake of democracy everywhere, I hope that we always will. Only the lack of determination against the forces of political stupidity could ever stop us. After our visit to the Klitschko Glass Bridge that night in 2019, Antonina and I walked back to Maidan Square where she'd parked her car. After she left, I stood in the square for a while, looking at the glass dome above the last Barricade restaurant. I looked again at the giant tarpaulin covering the ruins of the trade building with its giant words, "Freedom is our religion." I guess because I'm an old pilot and an engineer, while I stood in that square, I couldn't help but see a line. A great circle route, actually, or even a space-time geodesic if I want to get all Einsteinian. The line that I saw began in April of 2006 at the Quinn Chapel in the west end of Louisville, Kentucky, and it ended where I stood in October of 2019 above the last Barricade restaurant in Maidan Square, Kyiv. When I had dinner with my old friend Inka there in 2017, and when I had dinner there again with my new friend Antonina in 2019, none of us could have imagined how much more of that line there was left to be drawn, in both directions. Each of the line's endpoints were defined by quiet and violence, and in between those endpoints was a line that had been drawn by the people, for the people, doing what they had to do to defend their right to self-governance. And of course the line that I saw was only one of many lines just like it. Lines connecting people all across the history of this little planet of ours. Like the one that now connects the Abraham Lincoln of 1863 to the Volodymyr Zelensky of 2023. Along that line there are hundreds of thousands of Americans and Ukrainians who gave their last full measure of devotion to defend a just cause. If that all sounds a bit too corny and metaphysical, so be it. The lines are the several images, and democracy is what they represent. And even though there is untold human suffering along those lines, there is also truth. And the truth is beautiful. It's just. And it's good. I hope that a lot more of the politically intelligent draw many more of those lines, although I sincerely hope that no one has to suffer or die while doing so. And I hope that when politically intelligent people draw those lines, they'll have all the tools they need to properly manage this grand experiment we call democracy. Right now, they don't. But I hope that they will soon, before democracy itself ends up in exile. None of it will be easy and none of it will be cheap, but I still have enough faith in us to think that we can get it done. I think that we have to get it done. Right then, off we go.